Hi everyone. We're changing it up. I'm in the basement today. What I want to do today is get through the last part of World War One. I've sectioned this one off. This is the war itself, and then the peace settlement, right, with the Treaty of Versailles and Wilson's 14 points. So let's get to it. Okay, so first off, the fighting of the war. It was ugly, brutal, brutal, stupid war. All right, you know the combatants. This is what it looked like when in 1917, right? Italy had switched sides in 1915, and then also there were some people battling against the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Greece, Serbia, that area, and through there as well. Turkey is imploding, right? They're really not very powerful, and when I say Turkey, I'm kind of referring to the Ottoman Empire. But anyway, Russia is going to leave also in 1917 with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And so they are going to sue for peace, and in exchange, they have to give away a lot of territory to the Germans. Okay, other countries get involved as well. If you look at this map down here in Africa, where it's orange, those were the German colonies that they had established, and they are going to lose those as a result of losing the war and because of the Treaty of Versailles. The United States initiated a draft. This is only the second one in our nation's history. There was a draft to some extent with the Revolutionary War, but that was done at the state level through the militias, and so it doesn't really count at the federal level. The second one, well, the first one, was the Civil War. There was a draft that was initiated there on both sides, the North and the South. In that one, you could hire a substitute, remember? And so people were very critical of that, saying, well, this is just a rich man's war. In this Selective Service Act, in this draft, you could not hire a substitute. Anyone between the ages of 18 and 24 could be drafted. So you get about 24 million men who are registered for the draft. And I'm not sure, they probably did it by a lottery sort of thing, drawing names who was going to serve. And you had draft boards who would then go and look and see if they were qualified or if there's a way or if they would be deferred. If you were an essential worker in a certain industry, then you didn't have to go and fight because you were needed there. About 4.7 million people served in the military altogether. Not all of them saw combat. Those are about 2 million who saw combat. Here are the numbers of the people who died. 53,000 were killed in action. That's KIA. That's comparable to Vietnam. But if you look here, there's 63,000 who died from disease, and most likely quite a few of them died from the Spanish flu epidemic that just went through. The Spanish flu, as you know, killed more people than 4 years of fighting, right? Quite a bit more. And then there were a lot of people, about 205,000, who were wounded in action because there's the techniques, the warfare, the weapons were just so powerful during this time. Women served in the Navy and then also in the Marines. The Marines are very selective. They wouldn't allow African Americans to serve, but they did allow women. Today, I think you can't even get in the Marines if you don't have a college diploma. About 250,000 African Americans served. Initially, they served in units under American command, but then they kind of turned and started fighting for the French command, right? The French were very happy and they served very admirably under the French, right? Now, initially they were turned away from the draft or from enlistment. But when the draft came about, you get these all-white draft boards, especially in the South. They would draft black people, but then give deferments to white people. And a deferment means that you don't have to serve. Native Americans also served in the war in specific places. They were snipers, they were scouts, that sort of thing. They served in integrated units, unlike black soldiers who had to serve in segregated units. Okay, so Russia left the war in 1917, and what occurred there, and if you haven't seen the video yet already on the video quiz, you will, is that there was internal strife. The people there were really suffering. There were food shortages. They were suffering heavy losses to the Germans on the front. and they started to revolt against that. And there was so much unrest that uh, the Duma, which is their legislative body, and people in command there, encouraged the Tsar to abdicate, which he did. They established this provisional government that was democratic, that was put in place, and we've talked about this in the last section, but then Vladimir Lenin comes in, and there is conflict between the whites, the people who want the provisional government, they want democracy, and they're opposed by the Bolsheviks, who are the Reds, who want a communist system. So this leads them into a civil war, and they have combatants on both sides, and then the French and the British send some people in, and the Americans and the Japanese also get involved in this. But of course, the Reds are successful, and they sign a peace agreement with the Germans where they lose vast territory. But then that's going to free the Germans up to move troops to the Western Front to fight, fight against the British and the French in the trenches. Okay, the Americans who go over, they're known as the American Expeditionary Force. They initially go into England where they are trained, and then they're shipped over the canal and to reinforce the French and the British after years of fighting. They were exhausted, right? So really, that's our main role in the war, is to just outnumber the Germans and demoralize them and really bring down the morale. And we were very successful in doing that. So the Americans are referred to as doughboys or Yanks, and they got a very special warm welcome in England from the British women. And there's a lot that's been written about that. Initially, by June of 1917, we only had 14,000, but within a year, there's 1 million troops there already. And you just kind of keep pressuring and pressuring. And 10,000 were arriving daily, so they just couldn't handle all of these numbers. We weren't necessarily very well trained, but our numbers were just overwhelming, and it had a huge impact on the Germans. If you look here down at, I don't know, at the bottom of the slide there, we were only involved in 2 large battles, and that's San Miguel and then also Moose Argonne offensive, which is going to really lead to the end of the war. All right, this is the commander, General John J. Pershing. They called him Blackjack Pershing. He is a West Point grad. He served for a very long time, as all generals do. You don't get the rank of general quickly. It's through years and years of military service. And he served, you can go back and you can look. He didn't serve in the Civil War, but the Indian War, Spanish-American Wars, Philippines, Mexican Revolution, then of course World War I. Very highly regarded. You've probably heard the name, the Pershing Missile. It's named in honor of him. He's buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Okay, so if you look at the fighting, it's on land and it's on sea. The image here to the right, of course, is the trench warfare, where the British and the French are fighting against the Germans up there near the border of Belgium in northern France. But there's also fighting that's taking place on sea. The Germans continue to harass American and British ships with their submarines, their Untersee boats, the U-boats, right? And they're trying to cut the supply lines for the British and the French of goods and food and everything coming from the United States. The United States, what they do is they start sending people over and supplies over on ships, on convoys, so that, different ships, if there is a submarine or a German ship, then all of these ships could go after them. They also go in a zigzag pattern across the ocean and try to go very quickly to elude the Germans. There is no sonar or radar at this time, so it's kind of difficult to find your enemy out there on this vast, vast ocean. So they had to find ways to elude them. This is known as the first modern warfare. It's total war. And so we have civilian casualties. A lot of civilians died as a result of this. There was, of course, the trench warfare that just raged on for years. I know when I joined the Army in 1983, one of the first things, they're giving us all this training, and they're like, you need to change your socks all the time. You need to prevent trench foot, because I guess when you were down there and your feet were wet, all the time in the trenches, if there's water in there, then your feet start to the skin on your feet starts to rot, and so that's why they say keep your feet dry, change your socks often, and that sort of thing. So they were talking about this from World War One, which I thought was weird. But anyway, also there's automatic weaponry, airplanes, mustard gas, just ugly, ugly stuff. Here's some images of that. You can see at top right, here are some destroyers coming over in a convoy. And then you also see these poor combatants down in the trenches. On the left, they're wearing gas masks. That is to protect their faces, their eyes, their lungs from tear gas, mustard gas, and that sort of thing. Here are some fighting taking place. You can see these poor individuals trying to cross over what's known as no man's land as they go from their side of the trenches to the other side. I don't know how they thought that they would ever make it. This is from the German side. The only way that I know that is by the helmets. Those look like German helmets. Here we have some British soldiers who were blinded by tear gas. To be honest, I'm not sure if it was permanent or if it was temporary, but they're walking this way because it's the most efficient way to move a large number of blind people from one location to another. This individual was hit with mustard gas and it caused these huge welts on his skin, including his face. It's in his armpit, on his arm. He's probably suffering significantly. Here, there were a lot of horses that were used at this time too, because automobiles are fairly new, any sort of vehicle like that. So they used horses, and the horses too had to have gas masks. That helmet, you could see, we don't have helmets like that now. It covers all parts of your head. I guess this was to prevent things from falling down on you. The soldier up at the top right was Harry Truman. He served in World War I, and as you know, he's going to become president with the death of FDR. He had never gone to college, and to be an officer in the military, you have to go to college, you have to receive, officer training. And an officer, those are the people who are in charge of the enlisted personnel. He was enlisted in the military and he received a battlefield commission, which means that he became a commissioned officer, maybe due to his leadership abilities, but also too because maybe they lost critical leadership and they needed him. He was in probably a cavalry unit. You can see he rode horses. By his uniform, he has a crop and he's got riding pants on. This slide here shows some of the equipment that was used to fight the war. Airplanes were used. This is a biplane. The most famous pilot during the war was the Red Baron. I don't know his real name. He was a German. He shot down like 89 other planes during the war. He was shot down over France, and they gave him full military funeral burial. So I guess the other pilots respected him. You can see too to the right, these some automatic weapons that were used, and to the left, this thing here is very interesting. It's like an armored personnel carrier, one of the earliest out there. It's just a single individual. So this is a precursor to tanks. So those were being used as well. This guy to the right, and the third bullet, the main bullet point here was, this is Marshal Foch. He's the Supreme Allied Commander of all Allied troops in France. So he's in charge, and then all of our troops were under purging. We would not allow any American troops to serve under commanders in other armies, except for African Americans. They served under French command. So American involvement, if you look up there, the first bullet point and then subpoints there, we did send, as you know from reading chapter 1 of Lies My Teacher Told Me, Wilson sent troops into Russia to fight against the Red Army to try to prevent the Bolsheviks from taking power. They went in there with the Japanese forces. Part of the reason was to try to prevent the Japanese from taking over large territories there. But the main purpose really was to defeat the Bolsheviks. Right? The French and the British also sent troops in to fight against the Bolsheviks. They came in though, like just up in the Arctic, northern, like Finland and areas in through there, and they came in. Um, so anyway, as I said, Americans served as energetic replacements for the French and the British, and 1 million by June of 1918, with 10,000 soldiers arriving daily. Here's some of the major battles, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. Here at the Battle of Chateau-Thierry, what the Germans were trying to do, you can see them trying to push through these lines here. They were trying to go in between the French and the British, so if they did that, then they could get behind them and they could flank them and be victorious. So they have this major assault, they're really pushing all these troops there, and the British and then the French were able to hold them back. The Americans don't get involved up here where the trench warfare is taking place. They go just south of that along the border between Germany and France, and that's where they really get involved in trying to push them back, and were largely successful, as were the French and the British. But the Germans were just, they were demoralized, they were having internal strife, there was a lot of things taking place there. So the Battle of San Miguel, this is the first large battle that the United States was involved in. They were very successful, major push. We had about 500,000 of our troops and 100,000 French troops pushing the Germans back, and about 15,000 of them surrender. And you could see with the map on the right here as they kind of push in and push the Germans back many miles closer to their border. Okay, so this is the Battle of the Argonne Forest, also known as Moose Argonne. This is going to be where fighting is going to take place, very important fighting in World War II as well. So here, this is going to lead, this is kind of like the final assault. It goes on for, like, I think they said altogether like 100 days or so, because it was a part of a larger assault that was going on. But anyway, so they're pushing the Germans back, and the Germans, they just start to surrender in record numbers, and they have no choice but to sign an armistice where they end the fighting. So after the war, what happens is many of, oh, this is Meuse Argonne right here. Many of our soldiers, many of the British soldiers, when they died, they were buried right there. They weren't sent home. So we have American national cemeteries in northern France from World War I and World War II. This is where the armistice was signed. It's on Marshal Foch's railroad car. So German representatives go in there and they agree to halt the fighting. This was done at the 11th hour of the 11th day of November, which is the 11th month. In Europe, this is known as Armistice Day. In the United States, we celebrate it as Veterans Day. There are a couple of links here, neither of which are on your video quiz, but it shows actual footage of the events. And then the other one just shows a very quick overview of the war. So if you want to take your time to go back and look at those, it might be beneficial for you. Okay, so if you look at all of the casualties of the war, World War I, on the left, these are the Central Powers, and really Germany bore the greatest brunt from that. There were some Austro-Hungarian soldiers that were involved, but not as significantly as the Germans. It was mostly the Germans. And then if you look to the right here, in World War I with the Allied powers, you can see that Russia lost the largest number of troops from this war, civilians as well, and then France, and then England and Italy. The United States lost a very small number. So this is important to note, because when it comes to the peace agreement, the Allies really, or England and France, don't want to give America a huge say in that. They really didn't feel as if they had as much skin in the game. But more importantly, in the 1920s, the whole issue of repaying back all the money that American banks lent to these countries during the beginning of the war, they're going to say, like, you guys, we shouldn't have to pay this back. We suffered so much more than you did. You should just relieve us of this burden on there. And so this is going to be a point of contention, especially during the Great Depression. And there's going to be plans drawn up to basically eliminate the debt. The only country that ever paid back all of their debts was little Finland. Okay, this shows the number of deaths that occurred as a result. Again, you can see the total number of killed by far was the highest among Russians, and then the United States. If you look at that, we had 126,000. So as you know, as I told you, most of those were not combat deaths. They were deaths from disease, as many of these may have been. If you look at two, I guess they don't have civilians. I thought that this showed total civilians, but they do not. So anyway, let's go on. All right, so this shows the death of soldiers in World War I in comparison to others, right? World War II, there were 405,000 deaths. The greatest deaths we suffered was from the Civil War because both sides, of course, were Americans, and that was about 600,000, right? So the numbers of people who died as a result of being killed in action is very comparable to that of World War One. Korea, that number right there, 36,000 on this right here, I've seen it as high as 53,000, so it could differ. So now that the war is over, let's talk about settling the peace, shall we? So Wilson, in a speech in 1918, he goes before Congress, joint session. I'm assuming that this was his State of the Union speech, and he delivers his speech on his 14 points. And basically what he was arguing for, he said, you know, we need to have kind of a whole new world order, and we need to have an organization that's going to maintain this. So he called for certain principles, freedom of the sea, open covenants, meaning like you know, transparency when it comes to agreements and treaties and those sorts of things between nations. This was very inspirational for many places around the world, but a lot of the Allied leaders just kind of scoffed at it. They just dismissed it. Here are the 14 points. So first, public diplomacy, and this I'm talking about. You want to publicly negotiate treaties and those sorts of things. Everybody's to have freedom of the seas. Number three, free trade. Reduce the number of weapons, armaments that everybody has, so demilitarization instead of militarization. That was a problem starting the war. Impartial mediation of colonial claims. So you're going to kind of mediate over that. It's not that they're going to lose their colonies because these nations wanted to maintain control of their colonies. There's not going to be decolonization until after World War II, right? So that's in a post-colonialism. That's when that's going to happen. There's going to be also evacuation out of Russia. So Germany was supposed to give back the territory that they got as a result of the peace with Russia. Belgium would become an independent nation. Alsace-Lorraine, that area in dispute between Germany and France, that was going to go to France, right? Italy is going to get an expansion of territory in the northern part of that area up to the Alps, right? Austro-Hungarian Empire is going to be broken up, and there's going to be kind of this free development of new nations there. Turkey would be an independent country, as would Poland. Poland would be created again. And then Serbia and Montenegro and those areas there's going to be evacuation from there. What's going to happen, though, is we're going to get the creation of Yugoslavia under the strong leadership of Marshal Tito, but that's going to come later as well. All right, so the big one, though, is number 14. This is going to be the League of Nations, which was the precursor to the United Nations. All right, so all of the different members, there are about, I think there are like 30 different countries who come together at Versailles, which is a palace outside of Paris. It started as like the hunting lodge, but this is where they held court when we had like Louis XIV, Louis XV, Louis XVI there. And everything government kind of revolved around this location. So they meet at the Hall of Mirrors there at Versailles. And even though there were a lot of nations involved, there were three that took a leading role. They were the big three, and that was England, France, United States. Some would say the big four, and that would include Italy as well. So anyway, they're going to make these agreements. Everybody signs off on it, including Germany on June 28, 1919. This was like 5 years to the day after the death of Franz Ferdinand. Okay, here's an image of the big four. So you're going to have, I think, David Lloyd, the British Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, sorry, and then the Italian Prime Minister, and then Minister Clemenceau of France, and then of course Woodrow Wilson. He didn't send his Secretary of State; he goes himself. Right, so the objectives, they all have different objectives. The French and the British want reparations. They want Germany to pay for all of the damages as a result of the war. France really wants to punish Germany, right? They really want to cripple them. They want to humiliate the German people and they want to take over everything. England, they just want to reduce Germany's military. They wanted, and this is smart for them, they wanted to have Germany as a trading partner, right? So they didn't really want to demoralize them or humiliate them or anything like that, but they did want reparations, right? The United States really, Woodrow Wilson wanted his 14 points. He wants the League of Nations, and he's not going to get any of it, right? Italy wants more land up on the Adriatic. All right, there's certain issues that are going on. Number one, if you look at that first bullet point, England and France really they resent Wilson's moral authority or the position that he was taking, right? There's uneasiness because there's communist socialist movements going on throughout Europe. So this is going to be the beginning of the Red Scare in the United States. There's a lot of opposition to these 14 points because countries don't want to give up their autonomy and their authority to kind of assert their power elsewhere, right? And then England and France are seeking reparations. They finally set on $56 billion, but then that's scaled back to $9 billion, right? And that's going to be with the Dawes Plan of 1924. And this has to do with, and we'll get to it in the next chapter, but let me just give you an overview here. It has to do with England and France want their reparations from Germany. Germany doesn't have the money. So they are getting money from the United States. We're giving Germany money. Then Germany's paying England and France, and England and France paying the United States for the money that the United States lent them as a result of World War I. So it's really kind of stupid. It's this triangular pattern that's taking place. So the Dawes Plan is like, let's cut back the reparations and let's cut back how much you owe the United States. So the United States kind of flipped the bill for a lot of this stuff. So Wilson, he doesn't have much power at the negotiations because everybody knows that he doesn't have the support of his government at home. And that's always kind of critical because the Republicans had come in the midterm election. So that would have been in it would have been 1918, right? In the election there. And because this wasn't signed until 19, yeah, it says it right there, duh. But anyway, the Republicans gained control of the House and the Senate, and they were in opposition to the Treaty of Versailles. Okay, so Wilson, one thing he wanted to do is he tried to prevent the parceling off of all of this territory, but he couldn't. And so some people get some territorial gains. One thing that's really significant is that England and France went into the Middle East and they controlled regions of like Syria, Palestine, Jordan, Iraq, all of these areas, which is going to be important later because the British government kind of gives the Jews the right through the Balfour Declaration to declare the nation of Israel, which of course the Arab nations and the Palestinians in the region did not agree with. And so that was going to create the problems that we face currently or more recently with terrorism and everything taking place there. Also, the French go in and they occupy the Zar Valley. It's very wealthy in natural resources, coal and everything else. So this hurt the German economy quite a bit. You know, now they're having to pay reparations. They don't have the source of much of their wealth because it's being controlled by the French. So they have to give up the Rhineland and the Zar Valley in there. Italy also wants a port at Fiume, which is in Yugoslavia, which is in the northern Adriatic there. And then Japan is demanding regions that belong to China that was German territory, and Japan is going to get it, right? So all of these nations are getting some territorial gains. Okay, so here are some of the key restrictions placed on Germany as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. They had to accept guilt for the war. And for them, they didn't like that. That was very demoralizing for the German people. They had to pay reparations. It would be, by today's number, $400 billion, which was huge. They lose their colonies. They lose Alsace-Lorraine. They lose land in Belgium, Lithuania, Czechoslovakia, all this territory that they had claimed under Prussia and then during the war as well. They're occupied in the Saar Valley. The Rhineland is occupied for 15 years. They cannot join together with Austria, which of course Hitler's going to violate this with the Austrian Anschluss in the precursor to World War II. The Kaiser was going to be tried. He escaped to the Netherlands. To be honest with you, I don't know what the ending outcome was for him. And then also there are limitations placed on their military. They can only have a certain number of people, I think 100,000, and then it prohibits them from building up their navy or more armaments, which of course, again, Hitler's going to violate every aspect of this. Okay, here we see a whole big redistricting of Europe as the boundaries of nations are redrawn. Notice from 9 on the left to 10 on the right, Germany loses a lot of territory, but 9 on the right is Poland. Poland hadn't been in place for many years prior to this. Also, look, number 12 on the left, that's the Austro-Hungarian Empire. We're going to get a lot of different nations, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria, all these different nations that are going to be created as a result. And then Germany loses its colonial territory. So here again are the list of the military restrictions, right? 100,000 men, no tanks, heavy artillery, no general officers, which is kind of difficult to do. Navy restricted to 15,000, no submarines, all these different things. Hitler's going to violate that. He's going to start to build a backup military in the 1930s. Okay, here's some territory too that is going to be occupied and that they lost as a result of the treaty. This is the League of Nations. It was located in Geneva, Switzerland. The building is still there today, but it doesn't function as an international agency like it used to. But what it was meant to do was it was supposed to mediate disagreements among nations. It was going to try to get nations to disarm, that sort of thing. It was never successful, largely because the United States never joined. If you look at the nations that never joined, it's us, Nepal, and Saudi Arabia. I think all the other nations on here joined at one point or another. If you look at Russia, they joined, but then they left. Germany joined, but then they left too, because they were under Hitler. Okay, so then the job was to go, Wilson's going to come home and he's going to try to get the Senate to ratify the treaty. So presidents can make treaties, but they don't go into effect unless the Senate approves them by a 2/3 margin. The Republicans had control, and there's a lot of opposition to that. Henry Cabot Lodge was the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, and he's adamantly opposed to it, as are a lot of Democrats. And they're opposed to it because of Article X or 10 of the treaty. Basically, what that said is that if a member nation is attacked from someone else, then other nations have to go and support them in war. So essentially, this took away Congress's right to declare war. And so Congress is like, we're not going to give away our right. This is under, Article 1 of the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause, whatever it is. They can declare war, right? Anyway, so it was never ratified. Wilson tried, but failed. So, as I said, it was Article 10 that prevented its passage. Wilson would not modify that in any way. He was very set on it. It has to be my way or the highway. Maybe if he had changed this, the United States would have come along and had a modified version of the Treaty of Versailles, but it was never ratified. It was done with a simple resolution in Congress. They just kind of ended the war. Okay, so this slide gives a little bit more information as to why there was so much opposition in the Senate to the Treaty of Versailles. They held hearings about it, and they delayed everything. Henry Cabot Lodge had people appointed to the Foreign Relations Committee who were opposed to it. And a lot of these people, they were known as the irreconcilables. You can see that down there, 1, 2, 3, fourth bullet point. These were 16 senators who refused flat out. They were not going to accept the League of Nations. So Henry Cabot Lodge even had the treaty read into the document or into the official Senate record, and it took forever to do that. He wanted to delay that. So Wilson gets really frustrated. So he says, I'm going to take it to the American people. I'm going to try to sell it to them, and then they can convince their senators whether or not we're going to have this treaty. So that's when he goes on the road. So you can see in this slide, the map on the top, Wilson sets out at the northern part of the country, and he goes up, like through North Dakota, Montana, Washington, down through Oregon, in through California along the coast there. And then he's coming over through Colorado. And at this time, he gives this Pueblo speech, very impassioned speech. It's kind of new in a new way of speaking, in that you're really emotional. Back at that time, politicians were not emotional, but he gets very emotional giving his speech right at Pueblo. He was known. That's probably his most famous speech on this trip. He's followed as he goes by some of the irreconcilables, including Senator Hiram Johnson. Remember, the muckraker Republican congressman from California, and then William Boren. These guys go around, they give speeches too. They just kind of harass him and follow him wherever he's going, and they give the same speeches. But anyway, Wilson is exhausted. He collapsed September 1919. He goes on later to have this near fatal heart attack. If you look at the cartoon at the bottom right, you got these two guys behind the counter. They're supposed to represent the House and the Senate, and they're reading something else, right? And cartoons of unrest. And Wilson is leaving out this door, and he's got in his hands the League of Nations, and he's going through the door, which presumably he's going to take it to the American people. So that's what this is talking about here. So the treaty was defeated, but Wilson wasn't going to give up. There's a presidential election in 1920, and Wilson called this, if you go down to 1, 2, 3, fourth bullet point, and then an insert there, he calls the election of 1920 a solemn referendum. He said that if the American people voted for the Democrat Cox, then that would say that the American people wanted the treaty ratified, right? So that was Wilson's way of thinking. It was never ratified. It was defeated, right? And Congress just ended it, ended the treaty with a resolution. So this is the election of 1920. The people who were running, the guy on the left, what's his first name? James Cox. The Democrats chose him over Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1920 was Cox's running mate. Then you have Warren G. Harding, the guy with the eyebrows in the middle. Looks a little bit like McKinley. And then, of course, Eugene Debs. But Debs is running from prison, right? He was put in jail for violation of both the Espionage and the Sedition Act, and he got nearly 1 million votes. Okay, so here's some results of World War I. We always look at the cause and effects of a war, so this is very important. Women get the right to vote. Prohibition, right, out of this. We get the Great Migration, a large number of African Americans and whites actually leaving the South and going north to northern cities looking for jobs. There's this increased nativism after the war. Americans are going to want to shut its borders down. And part of that is due to the Red Scare. There's a fear that there's communism spreading here in the United States. Americans become very patriotic because they see they see the United States rising as a world superpower as a result of World War I and the fact that we went there and we won this war, right? So there's also the beginning of this quest for a new world order. So a lot of things are coming out of this. Here's some, just a few other things that happen. These are mostly just cartoons, political cartoons as we finish up this section of the chapter. So here, there are a lot of strikes after the war. People are demanding more pay, shorter hours, just kind of a readjustment to working relationship between the worker and the factory or the government at this time. So here you got coal miner strike, steel strike, Boston police strike, all of these in 1919, wanting better working conditions, more pay. And a lot of people, this cartoon is critical of these strikes between money and the corporate leadership and labor, because then you get all these other people coming in. If things are shut down here, then you get competition that's going to kind of move over. Coal miner strike. Okay, this one right here, this one, you can tell the artist's depiction of labor unrest. These people are trying to cause problems, leftists, communists, socialists, anywhere where you see red, that's communism. So this is a steel strike because there's the steel mill, and it's those people here coming in and striking. But you're supposed to be afraid because it's red, so you're supposed to be afraid of communism. Again, red showing here, November 1919, waving the Reds, got the Red Scare, these radicals. The Germans surrender in 1918, and now we're faced with this. So this is big. And remember, this as we go into the next chapter. Here again, a red or an anarchist coming in, trying to get into the United States anarchy. He's a red, and you can see him Bolshevism, so sneaking into the country. Policemen strike, helping out all these criminals. So this is all commentary on the strikes that are taking place. So that's the after effect of the war. All right, thanks for listening. Sorry it was so long.